For more on the Biden administration's response and for what's happening there in Afghanistan, we're joined by Chief Global Affairs Correspondent Martha Raddatz and Senior Foreign Correspondent Ian Pannell, who is in Afghanistan, has been reporting on the ground there since that final Taliban offensive took over. Martha, let me begin with you. Chairman Milley, General Milley, did say that the intelligence showed that things were very bad in Afghanistan, that there could be a rapid collapse, but he said the rapidity of it, how fast it happened, was a surprise. Listen to what he said.
There are warnings of a rapid collapse. I have previously said from this podium and in sworn testimony before Congress that the intelligence clearly indicated multiple scenarios were possible. One of those was an outright Taliban takeover following a rapid collapse of the Afghan security forces and the government. Another was a civil war, and a third was a negotiated settlement. However, the time frame of a rapid collapse, that was widely estimated and ranged from weeks to months and even years following our departure. There was nothing that I or anyone else saw that indicated a collapse of this army and this government in 11 days.
11 days, he went on to reiterate that he did not foresee a collapse of a military of that size in just 11 days. So, Martha, you've reported on the American military involvement in there, the effort to stand up this Afghan army for years. What do you make of that?
Well, I think, first of all, the intelligence community is getting blamed by a lot of people. What I had heard yesterday was that, in fact, the very earliest date that officials had been told was October. On the other hand, you have those Afghan security forces, and I know Chairman Milley and Secretary Austin were asked about this, why they didn't know those troops could collapse. We've been training them for 20 years, and even though there has been no one embedded with those troops outside the Afghan special forces, they surely knew about the corruption in those Afghan forces. General Milley was clearly defensive about the intelligence, and that, in fact, he confirmed that they didn't know about a rapid collapse in that country. And yet right now in that airport, and as Ian knows better than anybody right now, inside the airport, it may be secure. Outside the airport, it is not. And having the U.S. military get involved outside the airport would be a huge escalation. I think there has been. I know Secretary Austin didn't really answer this question, whether they wanted to send convoys out. He said, we have to secure the airport. We can't really start going to collect people. I know that has been discussed. Should we send convoys out to get people? Because they know full well that this isn't working outside the airport. It absolutely isn't working. They're watching television, they're listening to Ian Pannell, they're listening to others about what is happening outside that airport. And what worries them is if they send convoys out to collect people, do they really have the manpower to protect their own forces while they're picking up those people? Could it escalate? What if they do get in a firefight with Taliban? And that really could escalate this. You saw, again, a very defensive Chairman Milley talking about this. I think there is some anger at the Pentagon about the State Department. There's lots of finger pointing going on right now. Why didn't the State Department, and we should delineate this, the State Department is in charge of those visas, is in charge of getting those papers and everything else. And I am told that some of the paperwork and files were actually destroyed at the U.S. Embassy when they were evacuating. They burn things. They destroy things. They'd want to protect people who were working for the American government. And yet in doing that, they put them in danger. That was clearly a catch-22. Don't want anybody who might come into this embassy, the Taliban, to know who was working for us, but now some of that paperwork is destroyed. And I, right now, while we were on the air, got a text from someone, an active duty military person, trying to get his interpreter out, who is right now trying to get inside the airport. Even though he has paperwork, he cannot get in. And that is the real problem right now.
And Ian, I want to pick up on some of what Martha just said about the airport, because Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, he started off saying that the airport is able to function safely. But this, I think, is the first time that we're hearing from the leadership that, in his words, there are a number of threats still in the environment. In other words, it sounds like they're admitting that just keeping the airport secure has been a shaky operation, at least is now. I know just before this press conference, you were telling us what you saw just outside the perimeter of that airport. So we're not just talking about security widely outside the airport in Kabul itself or in other parts of Afghanistan, but you were right there outside the perimeter. What are things like there right now?
Yeah, I mean, actually here in the center of Kabul, things are pretty calm and life is slowly returning to normal. The only area of tension and conflict I've seen in the capital city is down by the airport, right at the gates. We just had a message from a female journalist. She also apparently has permission to leave. She just sent us a sort of video message right down there on the gate. She sent video of some of the other applicants who are also waiting outside. She says she's been there for 8 hours. The Taliban are firing in the air. It's dark. They're cold. They're hungry. There's no one looking after them. There is no procedure. There's no one to present the papers to. And the Taliban are really just in defensive mode. And unfortunately, their defensive mode also involves using automatic weapons to deter crowds from coming forward. But the question has to be asked, why isn't there another plan? I mean, it seems to me almost impossible that you could have US troops leaving that airfield, going into Kabul and collecting people. I can't see the Taliban accepting that in any way. But just as a model of what is happening, Qatar, which has its embassy still functioning here in Afghanistan, has done an incredible job of ferrying people out. These are people who've been involved in education programs, things that the Qatari embassy has sponsored here in the country, people who also have the right to get out of the country. And they have an orderly process whereby they have a number, they come to a collection point, they are processed, they're put on buses, and those buses then drive into the military side of the airport. Now, that seems to me the only real system. You can't just say to people, make your own way to the airport and run the gauntlet of the Taliban and 20,000 other people, and how many percentage of those people are eligible and are not. And that's part of the problem. The people who have the right documentation are being completely submerged by the thousands of other people who probably don't, but are also desperate to leave. So you need a processing center. You need to bus people in. It's a kind of, in some sense, a job for the UN, but I'm sure they don't have the capacity. But there are still many NGOs in the country who potentially could do. But all of this should have been planned before. But to hear Martha say that they've lost the names of some of those applicants who've been approved is just going to be heart-wrenching. There's one special immigrant visa applicant that we've been put in touch with by one of our colleagues. We've stayed close to him here in Kabul. He worked as an interpreter with the Green Berets out on the front lines, risked his life. He's put in his paperwork 8 months ago. He's got to the next stage. He's now just still waiting to hear. He went down to the gates last night. Again, they had to run away when the Taliban opened fire. He's now at home hiding, afraid to go out onto the streets because they're in this. It's not just a limbo, but it's a really dangerous one because they worry that if they come into contact with the Taliban, and whatever the Taliban say, whatever their assurances, the reality on the ground is almost all those promises we heard yesterday in the press conference. I can show you examples of where those have been breached in the last 24, 48 hours around the country, whether it's women's rights, whether it's allowing Afghans who work with the Americans to get to the airport. You name it, the Taliban have done the opposite, at least in isolated cases, because they don't have any command and control. They didn't expect to be in Kabul quite this quickly and running the government. They don't have systems in process. So you can say you're talking to the Taliban, but there isn't really a hierarchical structure here in place where you can say to one commander, this is the order, and you pass it on down the line. The Taliban fighters we came in contact with were wild. They were feral. They clearly weren't taking orders from anyone. Their just instinct was just to drive the crowds back. And it's an atmosphere of terror, of danger, and my fear is it will get significantly worse. The guns will stop pointing in the air, and at some point they will point towards the crowds, and there will be people there who served and helped the US-led mission, and they potentially have their lives in danger right now.
And Ian, when asked if they are considering sending forces to bring people to the airport safely, Lloyd Austin essentially said no, that they're focused on the airport right now. But he also said that the Taliban is allowing those with the proper credentials to go to the airport. That doesn't sound like it jives with what you're seeing and hearing. So where's the mismatch here? Is this a technicality over what the proper credentials mean, or is there a mishap in communication right now?
I mean, look, there clearly are some people getting through there who do have the right paperwork. Now, the means with which they're getting there, and I just cited the Qatari mission, is helping people who do have the right credentials to get through in an orderly fashion. So that explains why some people would be going through. But you've also got, I think, as I said, so many people there who don't have the right credentials that even if you do, getting to the gates, presenting your paper to a Taliban fighter who is trying to fend off a crowd, who is unruly, who has a weapon, who's using it freely, is almost impossible. So, yes, of course, some people will get through. But that doesn't mean that the system's working. I'm inundated with cases from people, colleagues in New York, ex-colleagues from the BBC, other media organisations, people who used to work in the media years ago who now know people here, just saying, can you help this person, can you help that person, because they're not being assisted by the US Embassy. So they've got to find a system here. The buck, Martha's absolutely right, the buck stops with the State Department. The military have got an impossible task. They're doing an incredible job there on the airfield, getting people out. I have a dear friend who got out on one of those Mercy flights yesterday. The photo of him and his kids on that flight was just heartbreaking. I mean, that's what it's all about, getting them out. Everyone wants the same thing. You've just got to have a process in place. And it's going to mean more than just having one little liaison between one Taliban commander and someone on the US airfield. It has to have proper intervention.
That's so well put, Ian. Heartbreaking, dispiriting. And Martha, it's pretty clear the Taliban right now, Milley and Austin were acknowledging this. They've got the whip hand. The Taliban will determine the extent of our efforts to some degree, and for all that the State Department can't get its act together or whatever, it's pretty clear where the buck really stops in the office with no corners, right? The Oval Office, the president is where the buck stops. And we understand he was briefed this morning. Let's look ahead. So, he's got the briefings now. He wants to move on from this. It's not going to let him. What can you tell us about what is being discussed at the White House and the mood behind those closed doors?
I think it's incredibly tense right now, and there is a lot of finger pointing, and I think it's why it is very unusual for someone like Chairman Milley to come out and say, hey, the intelligence, we didn't have any idea. The government usually hunkers down and kind of protects one another, but it is clear from what Chairman Milley said that he's very mad about that. I want to echo what Ian said about the military. The military in that airfield, I'm not sure any other country could have gotten there that quickly and done what they've done and tried to get people out. The problem is getting people to that airfield. There is frustration. There are lots of solutions that are going around, but again, a lot of fingers pointed at the intelligence. And certainly there was intelligence out there that the government could collapse, but a long time from there, and at the State Department. But the State Department's probably frustrated with the military because they're not helping people get there. But they understand the risks in that and the possible escalation. And it would take so many more military to get in there. The last thing the military wants to do is to go out into those streets and to have more people put in danger. So they would want to make sure that their force is protected. It's like putting on the oxygen in an airplane. They want to make sure their force is protected so they could protect others. And they are just not in a position to do that right now. So you have stranded people. I, too, have a dear friend who got out on one of those flights that the military operated so smoothly. But from the active duty military officer I know well, who had done some incredibly brave things in Afghanistan with his interpreter trying to get into the airport, said, I feel impotent right now and I'm grasping at straws to help where I can. I am sure the feeling is mutual for many. I don't know if anything can be done for him. I just can't stand around and let a friend and coworker potentially get killed. And that is the reality. They can potentially get killed. My Army friend told me that this interpreter's father has already been killed in Kabul the day the Taliban came into the country. I also want to say that Chairman Milley, when Chairman Milley was a colonel a long time ago, I was in Afghanistan with him. He made a point, as did Secretary Austin, that this is personal for them. You could feel that. Of course it's personal. They had interpreters. They care about what happens in that country and are truly distraught over what they're seeing now as well.
You sure could feel that in them, the frustration, the heartbreak, and I think the anger.
And the anger, too. The anger, too. And as you know, Terry, I was there at the end of June, and I was with General Scott Miller, who was the last general there and who pulled out on orders to pull out. You knew he didn't really want to go. He, too, said, at the time, this is the end of June when things really started falling apart as the U.S. military was pulling out, and that interpreters were terrified. The interpreters that I talked to at the end of June were terrified that the Taliban would come after them. General Miller said it was heartbreaking to him that he was not in a position to help his friends, and that is indeed when the State Department should have wrapped things up.
Our Chief Global Affairs Correspondent Martha Raddatz here in Washington and our Senior Foreign Correspondent Ian Pannell in Afghanistan. We're so lucky to have you both. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.